storms, bombs, and disease, these were the true enemies after Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, American barracks rotted in the tropical rain. Soldiers slept in tattered tents, boots filled with water, lungs riddled with illness. While Washington scrambled to turn the tide of war, Brigadier General Walter H. Rains stood over a map table covered in desperate red marks. He didn't need more guns. He needed a shelter that could withstand Category 5 winds, cost less than $1,000, and be built in a single day. In a warehouse in Rhode Island, a team of young engineers, led by Major Otto J. Brenner, was about to turn the impossible into reality. A steel sanctuary that could survive bombs, storms, and the hell of the tropics. But how did they make a curved sheet of steel save millions of lives? On the 7th of December 1941, Pearl Harbor burned fiercely, black smoke curling miles into the sky. But just 3 days later, amid frantic reports from the Pacific, the Pentagon recognized another enemy quieter, yet no less devastating than bombs: tropical rain. At battlefronts scattered from the Philippines to Wake Island, tens of thousands of American soldiers slept in rotting canvas tents. Monsoon winds brought 15 inches of rain in just 6 hours, toppling makeshift poles and turning camps into swamps. Within 3 weeks, ammunition depots grew moldy. Uniforms turned green with mildew, and pneumonia spread faster than war news. Each morning, stretchers carried exhausted soldiers from the camps not because of gunfire, but because they had no roof strong enough to last the night. In Washington, D.C., Brigadier General Walter H. Rains, Director of Army Engineering, stood beside a map covered in red dots. Each dot marked a flooded base, each circle a collapsed encampment. He realized this was no longer a simple logistics issue. It was an existential crisis for the entire Pacific campaign. Traditional wooden barracks required hundreds of skilled carpenters, rare materials, and weeks of construction utterly impossible on barren coral islands. Meanwhile, $12 canvas tents lasted barely a month. Every calculation led to the same cold conclusion: the war would end before half the troops had proper shelter. An emergency meeting convened at the War Department. Engineers, steel manufacturers, and Navy representatives crowded around a long table. Rains, with a piercing gaze, pointed to a brief memo: a cheap, lightweight, durable building, transportable and assemblable by untrained soldiers, 10,000 units in 6 months. No one spoke. Even the most seasoned experts exchanged uneasy glances. What he demanded was like designing a mobile city in the middle of a battlefield. Meanwhile, on distant battlefields, letters from soldiers began flooding back home. Tales of sleepless rainy nights, waterlogged boots, and relentless fevers from collapsed tents. One letter from a sergeant on Guadalcanal reached Rains' desk directly. The handwriting, shaky and smudged by rainwater, read, "If the enemy doesn't kill us, the jungle will do it first." Those words silenced the room. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. Within the vast machinery of the military, that cry for help reached the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, where a man with calloused hands, hardened by steel and sweat, entered the story: Major Otto J. Brenner. He had worked in Chicago's metal fabrication plants, knowing the limits of steel as intimately as the limits of human endurance. Upon receiving the assignment, Brenner said just one thing: "We're not building houses. We're manufacturing them." It was a simple idea, yet bold enough to change how the U.S. military viewed construction. The Navy needed something that could fit on a train car, cross oceans, be assembled in hours, and endure the tropical inferno. Canvas tents had failed. Wooden barracks were a luxury. Raines called it the Pacific's impossible equation. But Brenner didn't see it that way. He believed the answer lay in something ordinary in the curves of steel, typically used for warehouse roofs or viaducts, never considered for shelter. To find a path forward, Raines sent the engineers to consult the British allies. In North Africa, the British used the Nissen hut, a corrugated steel arch invented during World War I. A simple structure, semicircular, quick to assemble, housing 30 men. But in the Pacific climate, it was a disaster. The steel panels weighed 3 tons, the wooden frame inside was devoured by termites, and 2 tiny vents made the interior so hot soldiers could fry eggs on the walls. Brenner marked each flaw in red ink. Too heavy, too hot, too slow. But instead of discarding it, he kept the self-supporting arch, a simple, effective curve loved by both nature and mathematics. And so, in a freezing warehouse in Rhode Island, amid the clang of steel hammers and the crackle of radio war reports, a team of young engineers began their first shift. They didn't know they were starting a revolution in temporary architecture. They only knew that failure meant thousands of soldiers would keep sleeping in the rain. Brenner looked at his team, unshaven men with ink-stained hands, and said softly, "We don't have time to do it right. We only have time to get it done." Out there, the war raged. In the warehouse, a steel miracle was about to be forged. In the icy Rhode Island workshop, the screech of metal cutters mixed with radio broadcasts of battle reports from the Philippines. News of lost islands piled pressure on the team as heavy as the steel on their shoulders. Major Otto J. Brenner spread a large blueprint across a table, beside crumpled notes from the Navy. A handwritten line from Brigadier General Walter H. Raines stood out. Not about beauty, but about saving lives. Brenner knew this wasn't just an order, it was a vow to turn metal into survival. The team started with one reference point: the Nissen hut, a Canadian engineer's invention from World War I. A semicircular tent of corrugated steel. It housed 30 men, and was built with basic tools. The British used it successfully in North African deserts, but in the Pacific, where the air was thick with humidity and the ground soft as mud, the Nissen hut became a catastrophe. Young engineer Harold Drawson, Brenner's assistant, held the original British blueprint, its lines dense with numbers. 3 tons disassembled, requires a crane to erect, and needs a separate concrete foundation. "Sir, this can't be shipped through storms." Brenner nodded, adding a red line. No foundation, no wood, no specialization. What they sought had to be lighter than a jeep, tougher than a wooden house, and buildable by bare hands. The challenge wasn't just materials. The Nissen's small vents suited Libya's dry climate, but in the Philippines' 90% humidity, they turned the hut into a boiler. Hundreds of British soldiers fainted in the stifling heat. In rainforests, mold ate through paint in weeks, wood rotted, and bolts rusted until roofs collapsed like wet paper. Raines read a British staff report he called "The Climate's Indictment." Each line was a warning. No wood touching the ground. All bolts must be replaceable. Full ventilation, no condensation. That was the checklist Brenner held, shaping the entire design process. But great ideas often start with simplicity. Brenner realized the Nissen's semicircular arch was the key. A curved dome deflected wind, let rainwater slide off without pooling. It needed no vertical walls, and thus no weak points for storms to target. Nature seemed to offer the answer. Humans just needed to refine it. At the first internal meeting at Quonset Point, Brenner stood before a blackboard, drew a half circle, and said, "This isn't just a roof. It's an equation of wind and gravity. If we get it right, it won't fight the storm. It'll let the storm pass over." The team fell silent. In that moment, they understood they weren't building a structure, they were redefining wartime architecture. Under Brenner's lead, the engineers split into 3 research groups. Drossen's team handled aerodynamics, ensuring Category 5 winds couldn't lift the steel dome. The second group studied load-bearing structures and materials, eliminating wooden frames while maintaining stability. The third, led by engineer Arthur McConnell, focused on logistics, fitting everything into a train car, assembled by 6 soldiers who'd never held a wrench. At night, they worked under dim lights and the smell of machine oil. No time for polished sketches. Everything was drawn by hand, tested the same day. Fail, adjust, retry. They worked as if the world would collapse if they delayed an hour. One evening, Drossen handed Brenner a cardboard model. He carefully aimed a fan at it. The small dome trembled, then the wind slid over the top, curving downward. Brenner smiled. "That's it. The wind doesn't strike, it passes." In his report to Washington, he wrote one confident line: "We believe the curve can save lives." But belief wasn't enough. Countless questions remained. How to anchor a steel dome on sand? How to prevent rust in salty air? How to assemble quickly without machinery? And above all, how to do it all within a $1,000 budget per unit? Brigadier General Rains didn't want to hear about difficulties. His telegram to the Quonset workshop was blunt: "We have 60 days. Then the Marines ship out. They need shelter. 60 days to design, test, and produce a building that didn't yet exist." Brenner knew this wasn't just a deadline. It was a death sentence for any delay. That night, as the engineers slept slumped over tables, Brenner stood before the steel dome blueprint, holding a worn pencil. Outside, Rhode Island's sky poured rain, as if foreshadowing the Pacific storms his creation would face. He wrote one final line on the blueprint: "Quonset shelter of the storm, March 1942. On the shores of Narragansett Bay, cold winds cut through the metal warehouses of Quonset Point Naval Air Station. Trains from Pennsylvania roared into the yard, leaving trails of steam on the snow like battlefield smoke. Inside a vast warehouse, Major Otto J. Brenner and his engineers began a mission they weren't sure they'd mentally survive. The Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks assembled the best they had: structural engineers from Strand Steel Corporation, rapid assembly experts from George A. Fuller Construction, and officers who'd weathered Pacific storms. Each brought a piece of expertise, bound by 2 words on the contract: 60 days. Brenner didn't meet in a command room. He gathered the team in the warehouse amid piles of steel coils and the stench of grease. Holding a task list, he said, hoarse from sleepless nights, "We can't design the old way. No pretty blueprints, no time for theories. From now, we build as we think." The team went silent. No one had heard an Army engineer say that. But they understood. From that moment, they weren't designers, they were builders under war's pressure. Brenner split the team into 3. Drossen's group, calculating aerodynamics and wind loads, testing every conceivable arch angle. McConnell's group, optimizing logistics, ensuring all materials fit on a train, car, or container. Ruth Chandler's group, one of the few women, tackled fasteners and bolts, the Nissen hut's fatal flaw. Each morning, they sketched designs on brown paper, sent them to fabrication that day, and tested prototypes by night. If it broke, they adjusted. If it bent, they measured again. If it collapsed, they started over. The design-build-test cycle took 24 hours, what Brenner called fighting with pencils and hammers. The warehouse floor became a chaotic battlefield of bent steel, broken rivets, and hammering. Numbered steel panels tracked each revision. They didn't draw to present, they drew to survive. This process, later called prototype iteration, was to Brenner simply disciplined desperation. On day 10, they had their first prototype, a small, warped structure, corrugated steel panels, hand-riveted, patched together like a metal Frankenstein. But when Brenner stepped inside, light gleamed through the seams. The air felt clean, and the wind didn't leak in. "It breathes," he said softly. The next days, Drossen's team ran dozens of wind simulations with industrial fans. They found the arch's radius was key. Too steep, and the interior cramped, assembly slowed. Too flat, and wind could rip the structure off the ground. After 2 weeks, they settled on the perfect number, a 2.4-meter radius tall enough for a man to stand in the center, letting storms glide over instead of striking. McConnell calculated logistics to the inch. Each panel, 4.8 meters wide, the maximum size for a standard train car without special permits. Module length, 6 meters, light enough for 4 men to lift, yet long enough for living space. 8 modules together reached 48 feet, housing 36 soldiers with bunk beds. The next hurdle was weight. Each panel couldn't exceed 50 pounds for 2 men to carry. Flat steel was too soft. But corrugated, it was 3 times stronger. "Like folding paper," Drossen said during a test. "The ripples are the frame." Ruth Chandler solved the fastening problem. Instead of welding, time-consuming and skill-heavy, she proposed galvanized self-tapping steel bolts, spaced 6 inches apart. When wind hit, the force spread evenly across the panels, turning the dome into a giant metal cable. This simple idea cut assembly time by 40%. On day 25, Brenner got the first report. The prototype took 14 hours with 6 men. Too slow. He eliminated the wooden floor, using natural ground sand, coral, or packed earth. No floor means no termites, no rot. Assembly dropped to 8 hours. Weight cut by 500 kilograms per unit. By week 6, a complete structure stood in the warehouse. 96 corrugated steel panels, each under 22 kilograms, forming a sealed 6/8 square meter dome. Total material cost, $1,394 below the initial target. On a whiteboard, Brenner wrote one line, "It's ready for the battlefield." But the real test loomed. A thick, meteorological report from the Navy described storms that obliterated concrete structures in Guam. The engineers called it nature's interrogation. Before facing Category 5 winds and tropical rain, Brenner walked the warehouse, seeing exhausted engineers asleep on the floor, pencils still in hand. He knew failure meant not just their defeat, but thousands of lives lost. He paused, touching the first steel panel, cold, rough, gleaming under the light, and whispered, "Let it prove steel can save lives." April 1942. A foggy morning cloaked Rhode Island's harbor, but the Quonset Point warehouse glowed with light. After 40 sleepless days, Major Otto J. Brenner's team had built the first complete prototype, dubbed Model Q1. It stood silently in the warehouse, like half a giant steel tube rising from the ground, but to those who sweated over it, it was a steel miracle. When the doors opened, Brigadier General Walter H. Rains entered with 3 senior Navy officers. They offered no praise. Brenner knew this morning wasn't for celebration. It was an interrogation. He pointed to the first steel panel, his voice low and firm. "It all starts with the shape. No form resists nature better than an arch." Rains walked around the structure, touching the corrugated ridges where light reflected in silver streaks. Drawson explained. When wind hits a flat wall, force slams one point. But on a curve, it glides, splitting pressure into hundreds of directions. The wind can't hit what doesn't fight it, he said. The perfect 2.4-meter semicircular arch created what engineers called a compression ring. Forces traveled along the surface, self-balancing, needing no pillars or frame. This allowed them to eliminate the internal wooden frame, making the corrugated steel the sole load bearer. A hollow structure, yet stronger than anything the military had seen. When Raines asked about the foundation, Brenner replied curtly, "None." Silence filled the warehouse. "We set it directly on sand, soil, or gravel. No concrete, no floor. Steel anchor stakes and cables hold the four corners. Wind may shake it, but it won't lift off. If the ground shifts, the structure bends, not breaks." That was the game changer. Abandoning foundations, once a sacred construction rule, trading rigid strength for flexible survival. But the dome had to resist more than wind. It faced heat, humidity, and corrosion. Drawson recalled British soldiers' complaints about tin saunas. Condensation inside was a nightmare. They drilled double-vented shutters at both ends and along the roof's peak, enough for hot air to escape while staying waterproof. Early tests stunned the team. The interior was 10 degrees cooler than outside, just from natural convection. Ruth Chandler proposed hot dip galvanizing the entire surface. Some manufacturers balked at the $112 per unit cost increase. But she said one thing: rusty steel dies. So do the people inside. The galvanized coating wasn't just protection, it was a permanent chemical bond, giving the structure a 50-year lifespan instead of 5 months. When panels were dipped in 850 degrees Fahrenheit molten zinc, they flashed like molten silver, cooling to a matte gray. Like artillery shells, a lightweight armor for the entire building. The final challenge was weight and transport. McConnell calculated to the inch. 96 steel panels, each 22 kilograms, stacked like kitchen bowls. Packed. The entire hut stood 38 centimeters high, fitting a standard train car. Bolts, pins, and instructions came in a separate wooden crate. Total weight, 9,000 pounds, lighter than a military truck. A Liberty ship could carry 200 kits, sheltering 7,000 men. When Brenner finished, Raines asked one question: how long to build it? Brenner glanced at his watch and said, 8 hours. 6 men. No skilled labor. The room fell silent. Raines set his fountain pen on the report. 8 hours, he repeated, is the speed of war. The next week, the Navy held a full-scale test at the nearby Davisville site. Stopwatches clicked. 6 sailors, none trained in engineering, began building the dome under officers' scrutiny. They leveled the ground, joined steel panels, tightened bolts. Wind blew. Rain drizzled. But at the 8-hour mark, the structure stood complete. No cheers, just sighs of relief. Raines stepped inside. He touched the cold steel wall, listening to the rain tap the roof, a thick, steady sound, like a heartbeat. He said softly, "If it survives the storm, we've just changed warfare." And the storm came. On the 3rd of March, 1943, a winter storm swept Rhode Island with 75 mph winds and heavy snow. Sensors taped to the dome waited. As wind screamed over the top, the structure flexed 5 centimeters, then returned to shape. No leaks, no breaks. Brenner stood outside, snow on his shoulders, watching the dome hold its proud curve. He didn't need a report. He'd seen the miracle with his own eyes. In his diary that night, he wrote, "Today, the wind stopped being an enemy. It became a partner." August 1942. Liberty ships docked at Guadalcanal, carrying thousands of corrugated steel panels stacked like giant clamshells. Amid sporadic artillery fire, Marines unloaded 9,000-pound kits, sweat mixing with smoke and sea salt. This was the Quonset hut's first test, not in a warehouse, but on a real battlefield. The first structure rose beside Henderson Airfield, in pouring tropical rain and 35 degrees Celsius heat. 6 Marine engineers, hastily trained, took under 8 hours to complete a full dome. They stepped back, watching the steel glint under lightning in the tropical sky, then laughed nervously. "If it stands through the night, I'll believe in miracles," one said. 3 days later, the miracle faced its test. A Japanese bombing run nearly hit the mark. A 230 kg bomb landed less than 40 meters from a hut housing an aircraft maintenance crew. The shock wave uprooted palm trees, shredded nearby canvas tents. When the smoke cleared, the Quonset stood. The steel roof dented, a few corrugated panels buckled, but the frame held. Everyone inside alive. The report to Washington was one line: structure intact, personnel safe. To Brigadier General Walter H. Rains. That line was worth more than a battlefield victory. "Brenner," he said over the phone, "you've built a building that bows to storms and survives bombs." Quote, "But if fire and steel were one challenge, the tropical jungle was another. Silent, persistent, destroying from within." 2 weeks later, the first Guadalcanal huts showed red speckles rust around non-galvanized bolts. Salty air turned regular steel bolts to dust in days. Inside, nightly condensation dripped like rain, soaking beds and uniforms. Exhausted soldiers, fed up with the stifling heat, began cutting extra vents in the roofs with tin snips, ignoring technical guidelines. They added mesh screens, creating air gaps, and despite breaking structural specs, the results were stunning. Interior temperatures dropped nearly 15 degrees. Those field notes were sent back to Quonset Point. Brenner immediately ordered expanded ventilation systems and fully galvanized bolts for future batches. Meanwhile, other islands became natural laboratories. In February 1945, on volcanic Iwo Jima, black sand filled the air. Marine construction crews arrived 2 days after D-Day, bringing Quonset huts. But they soon realized volcanic sand wouldn't hold stakes. The solution? Improvisation. They used empty fuel drums, filled with sand, tying anchor cables to each hut's corners. When Japanese artillery blanketed the coast, wooden structures flattened, but the Quonsets endured. 3 weeks later, a 177 km/h storm swept through, and when the skies cleared, only the curved steel domes stood, defying both nature and war. The base commander's report to Pearl Harbor was brief: Quonset huts still standing, everything else gone. And, up north, a different test unfolded. The Aleutian Campaign, Alaska, 1,943. Winds at -40 degrees Celsius, sliced like blades, steel brittle as glass. Engineers found tiny cracks at bolt holes from thermal expansion. Drawson and McConnell, on site in thick snow, adjusted the design. They switched to low-carbon alloy steel, more ductile in extreme cold, and added rubber gaskets between joints. When heaters ran inside, another issue arose: extreme condensation. Warm air met cold steel, creating indoor rain. The jungle's lesson applied. They installed insulating blankets inside the dome and kept vents running all day, even in freezing cold. The result was the first Arctic Quonset hut: double-layered steel, cotton padding, and two-way ventilation. Not just tropics or Arctic, the Mediterranean proved the design's uncanny resilience. In Palermo, Sicily, 1944, A Quonset used as an ammo depot took a direct hit from an 88mm German shell. The round pierced the roof, exploding inside. By theory, the structure should have been shrapnel, but the dome channeled the blast outward, not inward. Steel twisted, the roof caved, but the frame didn't collapse. An EOD soldier later wrote, "If it was a rectangular building, we'd be buried under rubble." Then, in December 1944, Typhoon Cobra hit the Philippines. Winds of 225 kilometers per hour, 6-meter waves. Tacloban base was nearly obliterated. Wooden houses turned to dust. Concrete pillars toppled. But of 43 Quonset huts, 39 stood, 4 lightly damaged and repairable in hours. Engineers later found the deciding factor wasn't steel thickness, but anchoring. Huts anchored properly stood firm. Those with hasty anchors were tossed like weeds. After the storm, Rains wired Brenner. "Your design held the line against God's own storm." As the war dragged on, the Quonset hut evolved with each challenge. The 1945 version barely resembled the 1942 prototype. Expanded ventilation, improved latches, thicker galvanized steel, and insulation for extreme temperatures. These upgrades didn't come from labs, they came from the battlefield. June 1942. In Washington, the War Production Board signed an unprecedented order: mass deploy Quonset huts across the Pacific Theater. The Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks sent standardized blueprints to 10 major steel plants across the U.S., East and Midwest. Overnight, America's civilian industry shifted from farm tools and car parts to wartime shelters. Strand Steel's Philadelphia plant, once making water towers and grain silos, now bore a new sign: Quonset Division. George A. Fuller Construction retooled entire auto frame assembly lines to stamp corrugated steel panels. In Chicago, trains hauled steel coils through the night. Gleaming metal strips fed into wave-forming presses. Each ripple measured precisely at 7.67 centimeters for optimal strength. When flat steel was corrugated, it became 3 times stronger without added weight. Brenner called it the science of simplicity, America's way of winning with less, but better. After corrugation, panels were hot-dip galvanized in 850 degrees Fahrenheit, molten zinc baths. The coating didn't just prevent rust, it chemically bonded to the steel, making it one indestructible unit. The smell of molten metal and burning zinc filled factories, the scent of industry triumphing over nature. This process added $112 per unit. But Brenner rejected all cost-cutting suggestions. "If it's a choice between savings and lives," he said, "I choose lives." The numbers told a miraculous story. 8,000 units produced monthly by late 1943. 160,000 huts completed in 2 years. 6 million soldiers sheltered from storms, bombs, and disease. While Europe still built wooden barracks, Americans learned to package a building like a machine. Logistics set a new goal. Each hut had to fit a 40-foot train car, including 9 6-steel panels, 2 end walls, bolts, and instructions. Total weight 9,000 pounds. Every part was numbered. And every worker, even press operators, knew they were building shelter for someone on the battlefield. At West Coast ports, transportation hit an inhuman pace. Trains from Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia hauled kits to San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle. Each Liberty ship carried 200 kits, shelter for 7,200 soldiers. Cranes lifted kits so tightly packed, not an inch was wasted. Each kit came with an illustrated assembly guide for soldiers not fluent in English. The cover read, 6 men, 8 hours, no tools beyond your hands. Across the Pacific, the Navy's construction battalions, CBs, turned hut building into an art. They cleared ground, joined steel panels, tightened bolts, checked alignment with spirit levels. No skilled labor, no welding, no concrete, just 4 wrenches and 6 hands. In one day, they could build 5 or 6 huts. In a week, a new base rose as if from the earth. In January 1943, at Espiritu Santo, CB Team 12 set a record, 4 hours, 17 minutes, for one complete hut. The CB News called it the American Igloo, America's Dome. When Brigadier General Rains saw the final cost report, he couldn't believe his eyes. One Quonset hut. A hut. Shaloshmio Tashim Ve'arba and materials. Shishim. Labor hours. Build time. A hot day. Traditional wooden barracks. $12,000. 400 labor hours. Build time. 6 weeks. He scribbled in the margin. 1/10 the cost. 1/120 the time. Victory begins there. American industry born to make cars and washers became a war shelter assembly line. Within months, Detroit and Cleveland factories competed for higher output, calling themselves builders of temporary cities for freedom. By mid-1944, transport speed was unreal. From order placement in Pennsylvania to a completed hut in New Guinea just 40 days, including rail, ship, and battlefield assembly. No construction system in human history had matched that pace. But Brenner's proudest moment wasn't the numbers. It was the image of exhausted soldiers leaning against steel domes in the rainy night, hearing wind howl outside without fearing collapse. It was surgeons in Quonset field hospitals operating under oil lamps during storms, as everything else crumbled. Those domes weren't just shelters, they were the steel heartbeat of the war. In late 1944, Brenner received a telegram from Guam. "We live, because the roof holds." He needed no other reward. In his notebook, he wrote the year's final line. "We didn't just build a structure, we built a principle. When the world falls apart, you need something that can be rebuilt in a day." The 15th of August 1945. The war ended. Guns fell silent, the Pacific skies cleared, and hundreds of thousands of Quonset huts stood scattered across 6 continents from Guam, Okinawa, to Sicily, Alaska suddenly quiet. Built to shield soldiers in hell, they stood unsure of their purpose in peace. 170,000 huts. Enough to form a steel city, borderless, uncelebrated, just unyielding arches against wind and time. The War Assets Administration planned to liquidate them all. But something strange happened. No one wanted to discard them. Base commanders saw structures that endured bombs and storms for 3 years, still standing, dry, needing no repairs. They knew these domes weren't just temporary, they were eternal. Meanwhile, America faced a housing crisis. Millions of veterans returned with GI Bill benefits, but no homes. Construction lacked materials, workers, time. Thousands of families lived in old chicken coops, warehouses, or shared apartments with 3 other households. Then they heard the government was selling used Quonset huts, priced from $1,000 to $2,500. To those who lived under them in Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima, these weren't temporary homes, they were roofs that saved their lives. Quonset neighborhoods sprang up across America, as fast as they once rose in Pacific jungles. In Los Angeles, Roger Young Village housed over 750 families in repurposed Quonsets, wooden doors, lawns, white picket fences. In Portland, the Fairview Edition had 350 pastel-painted domes, mint green, lemon yellow, soft pink, where children played under steel curves that once echoed falling bombs. Veteran Sam McConnell, who helped design the Quonset's packing system, lived in one in Oregon. He hung a small wooden sign out front. Built for war, reborn for peace. Universities, booming with GI Bill students, also needed housing. In Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, thousands of Quonsets became dorms. Students called them tin can dorms, but none denied they enabled countless new beginnings. Some schools kept them into the 1,972 silent witnesses to the rebuilding era. And not just homes, churches, schools, workshops, community theaters turned to Quonsets as a cheap, durable miracle. In Levittown, Pennsylvania, the First Presbyterian Church held Sunday services for 15 years in a Quonset, white-painted walls, high curved ceiling, light reflecting softly like a cathedral's dome. The pastor told the congregation, "God can dwell anywhere, even in this steel arch." As America moved through the 1,950 seconds, the Quonset hut became a symbol of American pragmatism. Not beautiful, not fancy, not showy, but steadfast, efficient, adaptable to anything. Homes, classrooms, warehouses, or auto shops. In the Midwest, thousands of farmers bought civilian versions from Strand Steel. They used them for barns, grain storage, garages, or tractor repair shops. They found one annual hose down kept the dome standing for a lifetime. In later years, as color TV showed thriving suburbs, Quonset huts lingered in the background behind barns, churches, sports fields, a quiet legacy, not glamorous, but tougher than the things celebrated. By the 1,990 seconds, architectural historians recognized what earlier generations overlooked. The Quonset hut was one of the 20th century's most democratic designs, a building classless, buildable by anyone, anywhere. Surviving domes were declared historical landmarks, preserved as testaments to ingenuity and resilience in humanity's direst moments. Today, 8 decades later, the Quonset's DNA lives in every modern shelter, from UN refugee camps to prefabricated disaster relief homes to NASA's Mars habitat modules. All carry an undying philosophy: efficiency, flexibility, and humanity in the harshest limits. If Brenner and his sleepless Rhode Island team from 1942 could see the future, they might smile. They designed to win a war, unaware they'd built something to help humanity survive in peace. That simple steel dome, born as a Marine's refuge in a fiery storm, became the roof of a new world. The post-war world was full of ruins. But amid the wreckage, one thing stood unbowed: the Quonset's steel domes. Born from fear, from the desperation of engineers facing an impossible task in 60 days, they survived storms, bombs, and time itself. And when the guns fell silent, they became sanctuaries for peace, for returning soldiers, for the first GI Bill students, for small communities rising from crisis. From Rhode Island in 1942 to Haiti in 2010, from Guam to NASA's Mars Habitat Project, the principle endures. True strength lies not in materials, but in thinking. When time, resources, and safety are luxuries, the only thing left is the ability to rebuild from nothing. The Quonset hut isn't a perfect building. It's a perfect reminder. Simple things, born of courage and ingenuity, can outlast the grandest creations. Perhaps, in the future, when humans build their first home on Mars, that curved dome will appear a nod from the past. We survived once, and we will survive again.